My name is Jacob Burton. I'm the executive chef of Stella Restaurant and the Cedar House Sport Hotel. And real quick, before we jump into our week-long adventure, I want to give you a little bit of background of what we're going to be doing here this week and how this all came about. So, let me tell you a little story about how a coconut macaroon changed my life. When I first met my wife and we were dating, we had been together for about 4 months, her favorite treat was the coconut macaroon. And at that point, I was a decent cook. I hadn't gone to culinary school. I didn't know that much about cooking. I had maybe 10 dishes that I was comfortable with, that I felt that I could serve to people and they'd enjoy if they came over to eat. But I could follow recipes, so that was basically what I was capable of doing in the kitchen. So one day, I'm at home, it's my day off, and I'm watching the Food Network. And they got someone making a coconut macaroon, and they're like, oh yeah, it's real easy. It's mixed together, you fold the ingredients, you mold it, you put it on the little pan, you press the bake button, 15 minutes later, it's all good, right? And they show you the money shot at the end where they break open the coconut macaroon, you're like, oh, that looks awesome, yeah, great, I can do that. So I go online, I go to the website where they refer you at the end of the show. Like, go to this website, check this out, make this recipe. So I make it. It comes out horrible. It's disgusting. I'm like, oh, man, I missed something. I don't bake that much. I screwed up the recipe. Okay. So I make it again. And then the second time it doesn't come out. I'm like, oh. Okay, so I'm going to make it one more time. So I make it a third time. Third time, I follow the recipe to the T. Double check everything. I mean, literally, it took me about 30 minutes just to mix the ingredients because I was double checking everything, right? Third time it was awful. And I remember the rage that I felt. I mean, I was in rage. I felt betrayed. They gave me a bum recipe, right? I wasted half of a day trying to make coconut macaroons, which, by the way, I don't even like. I was doing it for my girlfriend who I wanted to impress, and they didn't give me the tools to troubleshoot. So I felt very intellectually insulted. You give me a bum recipe, you don't explain to me why you mix ingredients, why you bake it like this, and now your bum recipe is useless because I don't even understand. Like, how do I fix this? So literally, I went to culinary school the next week. Well, I signed up the next week. And I was in college, I was bored, so I was like, whatever. Let's take a dive off the cliff and see where this leads us. Well, it led me to my philosophy of technique is king. Understanding of food is king. Because cooks, whether you're a professional cook in the kitchen just starting out, or you're a cook at home, you're so dependent upon recipes, on other people's recipes. And if you do enough of the same recipe time and time again, you build this intuition, this sense for it. And then you can start to make it your own. But once you have a deep technical understanding of that recipe, then you can create your own recipes. So what I have here is the F-Step curriculum. It's a curriculum that I formulated specifically to brainwash you, to make you think like a chef, to kind of break that mold of, hey, I want to cook beef bourguignon tonight, so I need to go find the beef bourguignon recipe in one of my 100 cookbooks. It's like, no, I understand fundamentally what beef bourguignon is, the technique behind it, and what makes it good. And also, when it comes out bad, you're going to have the understanding of like, oh, this is where I went wrong. Because cooking, even though it seems like a creative process, and it is, what's great about cooking is it's very formulaic, and the outcome is very simple. And that's one of the things I really love about my job, is the honesty of it, right? I can sit there and bore you about all the different components, all the technical details that went into a dish, but if you put it in your mouth and it sucks, it sucks. There's no way around that. And that comes from technical error, execution error, flavor error, okay? So I'm going to write this formula on the board. So our formula that's just going to be drilled into you time and time again this week is flavor plus technique in parentheses times execution equals something, okay? Now this is important because, so you have your flavor, which we're going to talk today all about flavor. Today's our flavor lecture. So your flavor can be thought of as what you're going to cook. You got to decide, okay, I'm going to make a beef dish. Okay, so that's your flavor, and you have complementary flavors that go along with that. Okay, then you're going to apply technique, cooking technique to that beef. And you apply it, okay, cool. But you can have the best technique in the world, you can go out and buy the most expensive steak in the world, but if you can't execute it, then it doesn't matter. So this could be a 10. This could be a 10. If this is a 1, if your execution suffers, then it's a nothing. And that's one of the things that cookbooks in general do not teach you. They don't teach you how to handle the stress of cooking for 8 people. They don't teach you how to make decisions on the fly, how to use that intuition and be like, you know what? It's winter. It's cold. My plates are freezing. They need to go in the oven. You know, I need to make sure I bring my sauce back to a boil. All these different things. So we're going to focus a lot on execution this week. You're going to, obviously be executing in the kitchen all week. But what's more important is on your final day, you're going to take your execution and your understanding of flavor structure, and you're going to create your own dish and execute it. And we're going to go through all that stuff with you. So let's start with flavor, because flavor is really the most important thing. That's the first question that you're going to ask yourself when you're walking down the road of creating a new dish. What will I be cooking? And it sounds very simplistic, but when it should be. The whole entire formula is about simplifying your approach to food with this knowledge and this skill to execute. So you say to yourself, well, I'm going to cook chicken, right? Well, automatically you're eliminating certain ingredients. You're eliminating certain techniques, right? So you're making this conscious decision. You have this thought process in your head of, okay, well, if I'm going to be cooking chicken, well, what part of the chicken? Am I going to be cooking chicken breast? Am I going to be cooking chicken legs? Because the techniques that are applicable to the breast aren't the same techniques that are applicable to leg and thigh. And we'll talk a lot about that on our technique day. But first you have to construct flavors, which we very creatively call flavor structure. So this is where I start. When I'm going to create a new dish, I start with flavor structure. So, I ask myself, well, what's my new dish going to be? Oh, I'm going to do a short rib dish. Okay, so that's my starting point. But there's not this mind-boggling creativity that goes into creating a complex flavor structure. What goes into creating a good, solid, complex flavor structure, which really isn't that complex, is the understanding of the 5 basic flavors, the 5 basic tastes. And I'm sure you guys have seen these before, you've heard about them, right? Salty, sour, sweet, bitter, and umami. And these are the 5 major flavors that actually register on our tongue, on our taste buds. And a lot of the complexity of our flavor comes from aroma. About 70 to almost upwards of 85% of our perception of complex flavors comes from aroma, the olfactory system. But these flavors need to be in harmony. They need to balance one another when you're constructing dishes. And they contrast, mute, and balance each other. So salty and sour, very complementary, right? Margarita, lime, salt, it's delicious, okay? Bitter, you have something that's bitter, like a bitter green. Sweet balances. Salty and sweet will balance one another. Sweet obviously balances sour. So if you have a dish that's sweet, but it's maybe a little cloying, and it's one-dimensional, add a little bit of vinegar, okay? Add a little bit of lemon juice. Add some sour. And then you have umami, which is savory. That's your savory, meaty, mushroomy, roasted flavors, okay? All right, so that's it for flavor. Let's go to the kitchen and cook. Just kidding. All right, so that's the overview. Now let's get into this, okay? Let's start with salt. Salt, super important, obviously. Without a well-seasoned dish, without salt in your food, it's just never going to taste right. It's going to taste bland, pure and simple. The number one mistake that I see with amateur cooks who are new to cooking is they under-season their food. Now, this doesn't mean you should be making a salt bomb, okay? The seasoning in your food, the salt in your food shouldn't be perceptible unless you're doing something where you actually want it to be like crazy, like, like salt and pepper chicken wings. But for the most part, salt is there to enhance flavors. Now, how does salt enhance flavors? Well, we have salt on our palate. On our saliva, naturally, we have salt. We need salt to function, right? It's how our body, it's a natural mineral element that if we're deprived of, we're going to die. So our saliva contains about 0.4% salt in the saliva by weight. So anything below that threshold is going to taste off. It's going to taste under-seasoned, right? If you've ever baked a loaf of bread and forgot to leave the salt, or you forgot to put the salt in, I have. It's horrible, right? It tastes like cardboard. Comes out of the oven fresh and hot. It looks great, smells great, looks like bread. Now, but when you bite into a baguette, you don't say, hey, this baguette's salty. You say, hey, this tastes like a baguette. This is great, freshly baked. But it will literally taste stale, like cardboard. So what that means is you have a seasoning threshold of a bare minimum of 0.5% by weight to 1% by weight. So you could literally take a whole batch of soup and go through your entire cooking process. You get to the end, right? Never adding a single amount of salt to it. Put the whole thing on the scale, taking into account the weight of the pot, which you can just hit the tare button and pour it in, right? You add 0.5% to 1% salt by weight, boom, it's seasoned. You're there. Now you have to take into consideration, obviously, personal preference. If you're cooking for someone who's on a low sodium diet, they're going to have a much higher sensitivity to salt than someone who's just eating a normal diet who's not overly concerned about it. But this will at least get you in the ballpark. And because this is so important to have properly seasoned food, because constructing flavors, when you start adding layers of complexity, such as sour and bitter and sweet, you have to have your seasoning right. So this takes the guesswork out. So if you're like, I'm unsure, I don't know, and we're going to be tasting a lot of food together this week, side by side, okay? But if you say to yourself, I'm not really sure how much salt to add, this will get you in the ballpark. And you do this for a little while. You do this with some dishes. And then you taste it, and you get a sense of seasoning. And then if it still seems bland, that's when you move into your other flavors, and you start building contrasting flavors on top, layer after layer after layer, okay? Now, all salt is salt in the sense of sodium chloride, okay? This is our seasoning salt. Any chemists in the crowd? No? You? Are you a chemist? Okay. Good, so I can tell you lies and you won't even know. So, the word salt in a scientific term is a very, very broad category, right? But sodium chloride is what we call salt in our common vernacular of, hey, pass the salt, okay? And you see all different kinds of forms of salt existing in the world. Some will cost you upwards of $30 a pound. You're like, well, why is that, right? Because it all is just sodium chloride. That's it, it's sodium chloride. So what makes salt special isn't its chemical makeup, it's the shape. And shape is very important. Okay? So let's go through the various salts that you're going to come across and make the decision of whether or not you'll be purchasing them. Okay? So the first one is table salt, also known as iodized salt. And this is because a very small amount, in the tune of about 0.8% of iodide is added to table salt to prevent against goiter, which is still a major issue in third world countries, but being spoiled first world people, we get plenty of iodine in our diet from other substances. So we don't really need it anymore. It's kind of like a relic of the past. But people see, iodized salt, it's a blanket, it's comforting. It's what mom uses, right? So iodized salt is the stuff that you find in the salt shakers on your table, right? And under a microscope, it looks like that. You see that neat trick? Could have gone to art school. It's a dense crystal. It's a dense, compact, square crystal. No jagged edges. It doesn't dissolve that quickly, and it bounces around, right? So when you shake it onto something, a lot of times it's bouncing off your food, unless it's really moist. Like you got like a big bowl of spaghetti, and you shake it on top, okay? But it has no texture. It's very, very small. So it's just there to add salt or seasoning. But also, so iodide itself is somewhat volatile, and it oxidizes rather easily. So they have various different forms of antioxidants that they put in with iodide in very, very small amounts. One is the sodium ferrocyanide that just helps to kind of keep it from deteriorating and oxidizing. But also, even though they put a stabilizer in, iodized salt is volatile at high temperatures, about 350 plus. And it will oxidize at high temperatures, and it'll break down, become acrid. So, if you've ever eaten something, like say like a seared steak, or something that was put on a hot grill, that was seasoned with iodized salt beforehand, and you get that little metallic tinge in the back of your throat, the kind of like acrid tinge, like, what's that? That's kind of weird. That's the broken down iodide. So because of that, so let's think about this for a second. Searing a steak, above 350, yes. Grilling, yes. Baking bread, yes. My oven's at about 525 when I bake my baguettes. So iodized salt is out for anything that requires me to use high heat. So that leaves me for cold heat applications, what we call a finishing salt. But because of its compact, dense crystal, because it's small, it's not a very good finishing salt. It doesn't really adhere to anything, right? So for me, iodized salt literally has no place in my kitchen. It's not good for cooking. It's not good for finishing. Those are my two options. Now, if you have a jar of iodized salt at home and you're making a soup, and you can use it for that. If you're boiling pasta, you can use it for that. Salt your pasta water. But outside of that, iodized salt to me really doesn't have much of a place in my kitchen. So my go-to cooking salt is kosher. And this would be more accurately described as kosher ring salt, because technically all salt is kosher in the sense that you can eat it within the Jewish religion. So it's not the fact that they actually make the salt kosher. It's the fact that the salt is used in the koshering process, which is to purify meats by drawing out the blood. And so you have kosher salt, has large crystals. And this is a very, very detailed drawing that I've worked on forever. But they're jagged, right? And these jagged crystals are meant specifically to adhere to meat. Right, so you can salt it and it'll adhere and it'll draw out the blood and you rinse it, and that's part of the koshering process. So this makes it great for seasoning meat before I cook it, because it's literally manufactured to stick to meat. It also, you can find forms of kosher salt with iodine added, which they basically do it again, mainly to transition people from table salt to kosher salt, because people still think that they need iodine in their salt. But most of the major brands that you find at the supermarket don't contain iodine. It's just straight up kosher salt, right? So you can season a steak with it. It's going to stick to your steak, and you can sear it really hard on both sides, and you don't have to worry about the iodine breaking down and giving you an acrid flavor. So what's nice about kosher salt too is it's inexpensive, and it's also large, so you can see how much you're putting on a product. Whereas if you're sitting there with a salt shaker of iodized salt, you can sprinkle it all day long, and it's going to take a lot of salt to actually be able to visually see it. But also too, you'll get used to the feel in your hand, right? So for me, I use Diamond Crystal kosher salt, not because it's the best kosher salt out there, but it's because what I've always used. And when you pick up salt between your fingers all day long, every day for a decade, when someone switches out on you, you have a nervous breakdown. What's that? But also, too, I've gotten to the point where I've measured what a pinch is. Because someone asked me before, Jacob, what do you mean by a pinch of salt? Well, damn, that's kind of a good question. So, for me, personally, and I have sausage fingers, so your mileage may vary, is 1 finger per gram. 2 finger pinch, 2 grams of salt. 3 finger pinch, 3 grams of salt. So, and it's accurate as hell. You just pick it up and boom, you're there. So you realize that there's this intuitive sense to seasoning that forms. And that's also why I don't switch out my kosher salt. Because when I'm creating a new dish that I'm working on in the kitchen, I'll season it, right? Taste it. Okay, cool. Now, after about 20 times of doing that repetition, then you don't even think about it. You're like, boom, 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 boom. I know that's the exact amount of salt that food in that pan needs to be seasoned to how I like it, right? So kosher salt is a great all-purpose cooking salt. Then you have your fancy finishing salts, such as the sea salts or the French salt fleur de sel. And fleur de sel is kind of like the king of all finishing sauces or salts. It literally means flower of salt. And with fleur de sel, you have this delicate pyramid structure. And these little circles represent gaps. So it's not solid. So it's very, very fragile. So when you bite into it, you get this subtle crunch, and it almost makes it somewhat sweet. And it has nothing to do with its chemical makeup, because it's still sodium chloride. it has everything to do with how it interacts with your palate. So it delivers this really subtle, salty crunch that's great for finishing. Sprinkle it on the steaks as they go out, right? Sprinkle it on salads. And there's other various types of sea salt that, because of their crystal size, make them good for finishing. You have Maldon salt, which is a big, thick crystal. So you sprinkle that on a grilled steak and get that crunch. You get some texture from it. So what makes sea salt different than kosher salt, technically speaking? Absolutely nothing, especially in the United States. Because as far as the FDA is concerned, which is true, technically speaking, all salt is sea salt. Whether it's inland 2,000 miles because it comes from an ancient seabed that has since dried up, or it's actually a salt mine on the sea, all salt came from the sea. So you could literally have a salt manufacturer creating kosher salt and sea salt side by side, and the only difference is the labeling on the package. But you get to know certain brands, you get to know certain sea salts that you like to use for finishing. Fleur de sel, again, is a great go-to. You will find this in every single high-end fine dining kitchen. If they only have 2 salts, those 2 salts will be kosher salt and fleur de sel. And it adds a different taste perception. You know, that little finishing salt right on top really gives you a nice, good, just kind of spike of saltiness, right? So it's nice when you're eating through a plate of vegetables that are already seasoned well, but then you get this little punch of salt here and this little punch of salt there. And it dissolves quickly on the tongue, so it's there, then it's gone, okay? Now you also have your colored salts and your flavored salts. So you have the smoked sea salt, right? Which they actually they moisten and they smoke, and it gives it a smoky flavor. We have that on our butter that you had at dinner last night. So we sprinkle a little bit of smoked sea salt on our room temperature butter, right? And then you also have lava salts and like pink sand salts, and they're really more there because they look cool, you know. I mean, and there's nothing wrong with that. If you find like a gray salt or a black salt or a pink salt that works well as a finishing salt because it has a good structure and a good crunch to it, and it looks cool on the plate, then use it. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. And now you have also too, the newest, most trendiest salt is the Himalayan. The Himalayan pink salt. And this has been around forever, but now it's trendy because the hippies got their hands on it. And what makes it, you have iron oxide in the salt, which is what makes it actually pink. But there's a ton of other like trace minerals and nutrients. And what they'll say is like, oh, well, I don't use kosher salt. I use Himalayan pink sea salt because it has 83 trace nutrients and minerals in it. And it is really, really good for you, and that's why I look so great, because of salted yoga. Well, it's true that it has trace minerals in it, but if you look at your daily mineral count that you're supposed to be getting from it, they're so minute that you literally have to eat like 1,000 grams of the stuff a day, which would quickly kill you, to get your recommended mineral count from it. So if you have, so I have nothing against vitamins and minerals, but you're probably just better off taking a multivitamin and using the salt that you like. Okay? So that's salt in a nutshell. You're basically looking at salt for cooking and salt for finishing. Now salt, that's seasoning 101. That's flavor 101. Without salt, there is no flavor. Pure and simple. Okay? Seasoning 202 is sour. Once you understand how to season your food, the way you take it to the next level is a little bit of acid. Whether it's vinegar, verjus, and verjus is it's basically like sour grapes or sour fruit that's pressed and highly acidic, but it's never fermented. So it's kind of like a vinegar, but it has a different fresh quality to it. And then you have your citrus. Oranges, lemon, limes, grapefruit. Now, obviously, this isn't the only sour ingredients out there, but these are the major, especially citrus and vinegars. These are the major ones that are going to get you through, okay? And just like salt, especially with vinegars, you have some that you might want to cook with. They're a little less subdued. And then you have some really high-end, nice ones that you want to finish with or use in like a vinaigrette you want to keep raw. Okay, so a cooking vinegar could be rice wine, a generic champagne, balsamic, but these can also be used as finishing too. All right, but these are the ones that they have a pretty broad flavor. Unless you're using a really, really high-end aged balsamic, you can cook with it and the flavor is not going to necessarily break down. All right, but your finishing vinegars are going to be something along the lines of, 20-year aged balsamic, Moscato vinegar, aged sherry. All of which we have in the kitchen to play around with. And what I recommend is get yourself a little glass vial with an eyedropper and pop your favorite vinegar in there. Whether it's sherry, Moscato, champagne, even like rice wine vinegar is fine. And everything you cook for a month, just put a couple dots on it. Just a couple drops. Because like salt, acid will help to enhance the flavors of food without being perceptible, without being perceptibly sour. Okay, it's very, very important to actually season things properly. Now, everything you cook isn't going to need a couple of drops of vinegar, but I think it'll really open up your mind to what can be heightened by just a very small amount of acid added to a dish. Now, what makes acid important is its complementary status with the other major flavors. But what's really important is this right here, fat. Now, we're going to talk in a second more about the evolution of our understanding of like flavor perception and how we got to that point, okay? But fat is still debated as to whether or not you can taste fat, if you actually have receptors for fat, okay? I believe that we do. I don't believe it's just amino acids in the fat that make it taste like fat. I think we actually have receptors for it. But even if we don't, what we do know about fat is it's delicious, right? We've evolved to the point where we crave fattening foods, or animal fat specifically, because before we were these lazy, spoiled creatures that live in houses, it saved our lives. It got us through winter, okay? But also fat, even though it gives you a great mouthfeel and body, it coats the palate. And it coats the palate and deadens flavors. So you season something with salt, and you add fat, your flavors are now going to be a little bit off, okay? So you add a little bit of acid, and the acid will cut through. And it'll heighten your perception of that dish. Now, acid will also balance salt, and it's a big time balancer for sweet. I'm a big believer in adding small amounts of citrus to sweet desserts, okay, because it's basically the seasoning of the dessert world, as is salt, which is very commonly overlooked. People think because they're eating something sweet that they don't need salt in it, but it's still food. You still need to season it. So you have just a small sprinkling of salt on a dessert, and it's going to open up more flavors. And then you throw a couple drops of acid on top, and it's going to open up more flavors. It's going to allow your palate to receive more. So even though a dessert is kind of overarchingly sweet, that's where you build that complexity of flavor. That's the difference between, oh, hey, that's a good dessert, and oh man, that chocolate cake was amazing, right? Because you had an acidic component, you had a salty component. So get yourself some vinegars, definitely, and then you want to stock some citrus fruits. But that's also too like where you go to like a Chinese restaurant, you have like sweet and sour sauce. It's good. It's tons of vinegar balanced with sugar. What's not to like about it? And it gives you that really intense sense of flavor. Okay?
Can you explain like with the sorbet, the strawberry, you have the walnut oil, the fat, and then the salt.
Right.
Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so you all had, except for Daniel, but Daniel's eaten dinner here before, so you've all had our strawberry sorbet last night. And so you look at what makes a sorbet, and it's a simple syrup that's spun, so there's no fat in it. But I love the play of having finishing oils in general. So we put a walnut oil on it. We've also done pecan oil in the past, which is a lot of fun because it literally tastes like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It really does. And then you add a little bit of the Malden sea salt, which is a finishing salt. So it enhances that perception of sweetness. And there's also acid in the sorbet. Both the strawberries are acidic, even though you eat a ripe strawberry, like, oh, it's a sweet strawberry. Part of the complexity of that strawberry is it actually contains a lot of acid. And then we do put a little bit of lime juice in the sorbet as well. So what you have is one little just punch of flavor that has the salt, it has the sweet, it has the acid, and also has the fat. And that fat is really great at carrying flavors, and most aroma molecules that exist, right, that have the complexity of flavor in them, they're fat soluble, but they're not water soluble. And that's actually why we're able to taste those complex molecules, is because what happens is you put these foods that contain aroma molecules into your mouth, they hit your palate, which is water, and they fly off into your olfactory system, and that's how you sense them. You sense them through your nasal cavity. So there is an argument, though, that if a dish contains no fat at all, which sorbet by nature doesn't contain fat, it's just sugar and a water-based liquid, then you're going to be losing some of that complexity of flavor. And also, too, it just trips people out that you put walnut oil on sorbet, It's a lot of fun.
So what was your citrus on the bread pudding last night?
There is none.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's all about personal preference and taste. There's always rules that you adhere to, and then rules that you break consciously. And with the bread pudding, it's just like, look, let's take croissants, let's make a bread pudding, and just douse it in caramel. Like why overthink it? So sweet is the sugars of the world. And it takes parts per million wise, ppm. It takes the most parts per million of a sweet ingredient for it to actually register on our palate than any other ingredient out there. It's about 0.5% by weight. So a little bit more than salt, okay? But not much. And this is because, nature never intended us to go and, extract extract sugar in its purified form, right? This was nature's signal to us like, hey, this is good stuff. You should eat it. This is an apple, this is an orange, this is a carrot, all of which contain a good amount of sugar. And you eat it and it's nutritious for your body. All right, but we went and we refined sugar, which gives us the ability to do lots of great desserts and lots of great things that we couldn't do without raw sugar. But where sweet is very commonly overlooked is as a seasoning. Now again, because you can only register, so because it takes about 0.5% of sugar for you to even think there's something sweet going on. But really, when you combine it with all the other ingredients, you're going to need more. You're probably about 0.75% to 1.5% of sugar. Okay, because just like anything else, it's a combination of ingredients. So if I took a glass of water and I dissolved 0.5% sugar into that water, you might be able to be like, oh, it's kind of sweet. Just barely maybe. There's some perceptible sugar there. Okay. But in a dish, it's a lot harder to pull out, especially since we associate sweet with quality of ingredient. Think about it. Great carrot is sweet. Great tomato is sweet. A great apple is sweet. Okay? So you add, very commonly, like stir-fried vegetables in Asian cuisine. Stir-fried veggies, sugar, just a little sprinkling. The French, they use a tiny bit of sugar in their vegetables, and they call it glaçage, which is basically glazing. So you extract the starches from the vegetables by simmering them slowly, and then you also add a sprinkling of sugar. And as the cooking liquid reduces, it becomes this glace that glazes the vegetables. And it gives you a lot of flavor.